Shortly after my son was born, my then husband and I bought a 100-year-old house for our expanding family, which included the three of us and our medium-large dog. As someone who grew up afraid of the dark after a strange incident with a neighbor boy looking in my windows as a child, I repeatedly had to tell myself that the creaks and thumps and sounds were normal for a house of that age, with old-growth trees that bumped the roof and scraped the windows at night, and noisy radiant heat, and a back gate that wouldn't stay shut and clanked in the wind. I'd hear something, and instead of investigating, I'd hide under the covers like any reasonable adult. When my then husband and I split up, I kept the creaky house, and he kept the medium-large dog. When my son was still small, the two of us were watching a movie in the front room around dusk when my phone died. As a Type B personality, the one charger I had was typically strewn somewhere about the house. This time, I found it in the kitchen. But as I crossed to the counter to plug it in, I had the overwhelming, goosebumpy, tingly, sinking sense that something was very, very wrong. I turned, and I realized that not only was the back gate open again, someone was sitting cross-legged in the yard, seemingly staring at the house. They had a hood and dark sunglasses, despite the fleeting light, and didn't move even when I stepped closer to the window to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. They remained eerily motionless when I was certain they could see me, and still even when I was pretty sure they could see that I had seen them. I quickly locked the back door, grabbed my phone and my charger, and headed into the dining room to my laptop, where I sent the first person I could see online a message that someone was sitting in my yard, staring at my house, and that my phone was dead, and to please call the police if they didn't hear from me in a few minutes. I assumed whoever was in the yard would leave once sighted, but nevertheless waited on tenterhooks, impatiently staring at my still useless phone. After an awkward conversation with my son about why we weren't going to the kitchen to get a glass of water, it finally lit up and I was able to call 911. I tried to calmly explain to the dispatcher that I was sure the person was gone, but begged that they please send an officer to check my yard, as the motionless staring was unsettling at best. Keeping me on the phone, she asked if I could look out a window without being seen to verify, as well as check the locked door. I awkwardly crept as stealthily as I could toward the kitchen, slowly realizing that while the back door was locked, it also had a very clearly too large dog door with no functioning way to block it. Panicking, I stood slightly in an attempt to scan the yard and came face to face with a hood and sunglasses staring down at me through the window. At this point, I was incoherent, as the dispatcher urged me to grab my son and hightail it to a locked room. I dart back to him and explain we need to go, now, and as I pick him up, I hear the clear and unmistakable sound of the dog door slowly opening. I abandoned the house, leaving the front door wide open, and dashed across the street to pound on my neighbor's door. Once inside, they kindly paused their dinner party to distract my son, while I stared across the street and messily sobbed about our very indoor cat we left behind. Not long after the officers arrived, they came through the side gate with hood and sunglasses in tow. They'd apprehended her calmly sitting on my back step, her arm lazily, purposefully swinging in and out of the dog door. I boarded the dog door shut that night, but we moved shortly thereafter, as I was never quite sure after that if all the nighttime knocks and bumps and open gates I'd been hearing were actually just the old house.
Back in the late 2000s, I was in my early 20s and living happily for a few years as a broke expat in Berlin. One of my roommates, who was from the UK, and I were out late-ish seeing a band play, maybe around midnight or 1 a.m., and afterwards we were headed home, walking through a relatively central but quiet part of the city towards a subway station entrance. We were in high spirits after a couple drinks and a fun night out. Not too drunk, just a little tipsy. And we were laughing and chatting, probably somewhat loudly, as we headed arm in arm towards the subway entrance, which was ahead of us down at the far end of a long, quiet street. It was late October, early November, and still warm enough for it to feel nice to walk outside, and the misty air hung in yellow halos under the streetlights. Just as a little gust of wind blew some leaves across the pavement in front of us, we both became aware of a figure walking ahead of us in the mist. From the back, it appeared to be an older woman, stooped over, carrying bags in each hand, and walking with a very pronounced limp, sort of dragging one of her legs along behind her. We were speaking English and nearly about to pass her around the sidewalk when the woman cried out, rather exaggeratedly, in English but with a thick German accent, "Oh, help! Won't somebody help me?" She didn't sound frightened or worried so much as deeply demanding, and her tone of voice suggested she expected to be helped. My roommate tried to keep us moving ahead past her, but I softened and slowed down my pace because, after all, this was an elderly woman carrying bags late at night, and she clearly couldn't walk very well. I asked her what she needed help with, and she said, "It's my leg. Help me carry the bags. I live just over there." And she nodded towards an apartment building entryway half a block up the street. My inner Good Samaritan instincts kicked in, and I responded automatically, "Oh, of course we'll help you." My roommate seemed decidedly less enthused for some reason, but begrudgingly followed me as we each grabbed one of the woman's bags and carted them to the doorstep up the street. As the woman's face came into sharper relief underneath a nearby streetlight, I realized that she looked exactly like a witch out of a German fairy tale. Bent posture, a large wart on her nose, grayish-white straggly hair, and she was wearing dark wool clothing with a hood. I was honestly taken aback by her appearance and nearly gasped out loud, but again, wanting to be polite, I pushed this to the back of my mind. Who cares what she looks like? I told myself. She's just an elderly lady who needs our help. When we arrived at her building's doorstep, the entryway door was surprisingly ajar, not the norm at all in the neighborhood we were in, and she pushed it open easily, suddenly seeming to possess more strength than she had had moments before, and leaned forward to hold it for me, so that I could go in first, and she would be behind me. She gestured up a dark and dingy flight of stairs and breathed, "Just up the stairs, just up the stairs." I froze in my tracks for a second in the doorway as my tipsy 23-year-old brain tried to puzzle it out. Logically, the polite thing to do would be to carry the bag up the stairs for this woman, right? But then again, all the hairs were standing up on the back of my neck, and the building's hallway and narrow staircase in the dim fluorescent yellow light looked awfully foreboding. I could just make out a doorway at the top of the stairs on the right-hand side that was also slightly ajar, leading into an apartment. An air of intensely stale, musty smoke wafted down the stairs. And then there was the tone of stark urgency in the woman's voice as she urged me to step fully inside and get up the stairs as quickly as possible. If I had to describe her tone, it wasn't too far from the voice of a cartoon villain rubbing their hands together while hatching a nefarious plan. As I stood in the entryway, tipsily trying to weigh the very bad feeling in the pit of my stomach against my lifelong fear of being impolite, I actually giggled at how absurdly horror movie-esque the moment felt. So much so that it couldn't be a real threat, right? It was too spot on, so I must be imagining it. Fortunately, my roommate, who had seen more shit in her life than I had at that point, literally yelled out, "Oh, hell no!" and hooked her arm into mine and pulled me out the door and down the street as quickly as possible. The old woman yelled disappointedly after us as my roommate whisked me across the street and down the subway stairs, back into the safety of a warm, brightly lit public space full of people. Once we had safely escaped, my roommate shared the two things that had set off definitive alarm bells in her head. One, she was certain that the woman's limp wasn't there initially as she walked ahead of us, and that it had only appeared as we got closer to her. And two, in her words, "As you stood in the doorway, I suddenly knew that she had a creepy adult son waiting for us at the top of the stairs, who was going to chain you to her bed." It was perhaps just our fanciful imaginations, but I have always felt grateful to my roommate's instincts for keeping us away from whatever was at the top of those stairs.
Many years ago, our son went through an extreme night terrors phase that gradually morphed to include sleepwalking. He was only 3 at the time, and not very articulate yet. He didn't seem to remember the night terrors, and wasn't afraid of being alone in his room, or even of going to bed on his own. Thither he would go without any prompting, and we'd go check on him and see his little sneakers neatly placed beside his bed, and him curled up under the covers in his PJs. We found that having him sleep in bed with us prevented these episodes altogether. So for weeks we did just that. It was a bit of a squash, but definitely beat the alternative. But shortly after we resorted to this fix was when the sleepwalking began. One night I felt him clamber over me, and groggily I assumed he had to go to the bathroom, and almost instantly fell back to sleep. I woke to his terrified screams, disoriented about where he was. My husband found him, shaking uncontrollably, next to his bed, eyes dilated and blank with horror. We carried him back to our bed, holding him close, and waited for him to fall back asleep. This continued to happen off and on for weeks before my mom brought a lady who was a self-proclaimed curandera, or witch doctor, to our home and had her cleanse it. She said our house had a lot of negative energy from previous tenants and restless spirits of small children who had become attached to our son. This was all horrifying to hear. We had experienced odd things, but none more disconcerting than our son's night terrors. The night terror stopped after her cleansing, but other activity kicked up, and we continued to have our son sleep in our room, terrified that he'd have another episode. Some of the other experiences were knocks within the walls, doors opening on their own, pictures flying off the wall, doors slamming shut as you approached them, though no one was on the other side to have been able to slam them. We once experienced seeing the shadow of a person, a man, walking around the house, but when we peeked outside, there was no one there.
The last straw was when the both of us had the same nightmare. Woke drenched in sweat and seeking comfort from the horrifying dream, only to tell it and realize we'd been dreaming nearly the same thing. In the dream, we were across the street talking to our neighbors when they pointed out that our house was on fire. We looked back and saw that the house was enveloped in black smoke. We could see our son banging his fists helplessly against the front bay window. Panicked, we rushed across the street and into the house, searching for him. In my dream, I found him and held him tightly to me as I ran back outside to safety, only to realize the bundle I held in my arms was his baby blanket, and not him. I stared back at the house in time to see it collapse in a fury of flames, and woke up screaming. My husband dreamt he went into the house and could hear my son crying out for him and couldn't find him. Then he heard a soft "Daddy," and reached down and grabbed him up and ran outside. As he ran, he realized that our son felt very light in his arms, and when he looked down, he saw he was only holding a teddy bear. Needless to say, this rattled us even more. We promptly moved out, staying in my parents' small guest room until we could sell the house. It wasn't on the market long, and wanting to be upfront about our experiences, we told the buyer against our realtor's advice. He was a much older man who planned to use it as a rental property, and waved off our experiences as nervous nonsense.